We're going to show how to work with context today. As we explained before, Node-RED is a asynchronous software. Asynchronous means that data would be transferred from one block to the next block to the next block. As data gets transferred to the next block, all variables gets destroyed in the previous block. This is to save memory. This makes Node-RED very memory efficient. However, the problem with that is if you need to save some information to use that information later, you cannot do it by default. So this is where context comes in. You can save context variables so that you can use them later. So we'll do a very simple example here. Let's assume that every time I click on a button, we wanted to increment the count. So we need to keep that count variable in the system. We cannot have it destroyed after data goes through the block. So we need to use the context variable to do that. So first, what we do is that we need to initialize that count variable to 0. And we can do that through a timestamp block where what we simply do is we inject, a timestamp or whatever data, it doesn't matter, after say 0.1 second to the next block, and we do not repeat this operation again. So then the next block, we basically set flow.count to 0. So flow.count is a context variable. It's called a flow context variable. This means that this variable count can be used in other nodes in the same flow here. You can also set a global context variable. Global context variable would allow you to share count across all the different flows or tabs in your solution. The other feature is that you can choose to save the context variable to memory only, which means that if Node-RED or Prescient Designer gets restarted, that value in that variable will be lost. Or you can choose to save the context variable to file. If you save it to file, then the value in the context variable would stay the next time. So you have either choice. And so basically here, when we initialize, after about 0.1 second, after the flow gets loaded, we set the flow.count to 0. This is how you initialize the count variable. Now, I'm going to show you 3 ways to do this counter. The first way is through the change node. So what you do is very similar to what you do in a software program. So first you set something called a temporary variable to flow.count. So this is the current value of flow.count. And then you increment the temp variable by 1. You can do math using the JSON-ATA expression, which is provided here. And after you increment the temp variable, you save it back to flow.count. And this here, I say flow.count to message.payload simply to plot it in the debug window. So it's pretty simple. You create a temporary variable, increment the temporary variable, save it back to the context variable, and that's it. So let's see this in action. So if I go to the debug panel here, if I hit timestamp, you can see that initially the count value is 0, right? So now if I hit it again, that count variable just gets incremented every time I hit it. So obviously the count variable is saved so that you can access it later, right? So this is a second way of doing the increment. It's similar to the first way I showed, but once you get familiar with working with Node-RED, you can simply just use the JSONADA expression to do the whole operation. So in JSONADA, you can load a flow context using this expression here. If it's a global variable, it would be global context. And then you put in the context variable name. Then you can specify whether it's from memory or from file. So if your context variable is saved to file, you put file here. You actually do not need to put memory only here if it comes from memory. Memory is the default. But I put it here to remind me that there's a different option, the file option. So in JSONADA, you can directly do math. So you just do +1 here. So you're loading the flow.count variable, and then you add 1, you save it back to flow.count in just one expression. So as you get more familiar with Node-RED, you can do things like this. So now if I click here, you can see that the count variable keep getting incremented. Obviously, because count is saved in memory, so if I click, it'll increment from the previous value that we did here, right? So the third way of working with context variable is through just using a function node. This is probably something that you feel comfortable with if you know how to do programming. The process is very similar to using a change node, as in the first case. It's just now you're just writing code. So first you save, you retrieve the count variable to a temp variable here. And if you use a function node, you can actually initialize the variable to 0 directly here. You would not need to initialize like what we did before, which is pretty nice. And you increment that temp variable, and now you can save it back to the context variable count through the flow.set command. Again, you don't need to put memory only here if it's from memory. But if your variable is in file, then you need to put file here. I actually use the file option a lot more. This is because, in many cases, if you restart Node-RED or restart, reload the flow, you don't want it to lose your, count variable. But memory is also useful if that's what you need. So now, I save it back to message.payload just for printing to the debugging window. So as you can see, if I click here, the count variable keeps getting incremented. Another place where you can see all the context variables is through the context data panel here. So if I click here, you can see that you can have node context, flow context, global context. You can use node context inside a function node. What this simply means is that only the function node itself has access to that context variable. As we explained, flow context variable can be used everywhere across one flow on one tab, and global context variable can be used everywhere across all the different tabs. So what you have to do is you always have to refresh to get the variables, especially the current value. You have to remember always to manually refresh. This doesn't automatically update to the current value. So here you can see that we have a count context variable. The current value is 7. And there's a counter context variable somewhere. It's actually stored in file with a value of 4. So you can see all your context variables here. Now let's take a look at the global context variable, there's one context variable I wanted to show you. That context variable is something we have set for you in Prescient Designer. It's called DevicesInUse. What this context variable does is it lists all the devices in your system, and it provides system information, on the devices. So, for example, what is the node ID? What is the node name? Where the device is used? What's a subflow ID? Where that device is used, etc. So let me show you this one here, because this one, there's multiple subflows that uses this edge device. So that's why there's a 0, which tells you that it's used in a node name called the devices. But there's also a 1, which tells you that there's another node called edge devices that uses this physical device. So what the DevicesInUse context variable would give you all the information of all the devices that's in use. So you can use that to do different things. So for example, in one example, what I do is I wanted to create a list of nodes of all the physical devices that I can pick to show data on a dashboard. So basically, if I select a different device here, then all the data here comes from that particular device, right? So if I switch, back here, then all the data coming now comes from this device. So I would need all the device IDs, basically. And the way to do that is here, I load the DevicesInUse context variable. It's a global variable, so I have to use the global. And also it's from file, so you can see that the file option is highlighted here. So now my temp variable basically is this JSON object. And then I get the keys of this temp variable. Right, the keys are simply the names here. Those are the keys of the JSON object. So I can get the keys. So I have a list of those keys, and I can display them in that pull down menu there. Here I also add an option called simulated to represent a simulated device. But that has nothing to do with context variables. So you can see that we define some context variables that you can use. You can define your own context variables. Those context variables stay with either the flow or with a whole design, so that you can use them for different purposes.